Hello. So in this video for Thanksgiving 2020, I'm going to talk about Grand Chief Ronald Derrickson's book, Fight or Submit, Standing Tall in Two Worlds. So this video specifically is in honor of the indigenous inhabitants of North America. Grand Chief Ron Derrickson is a member of the Westbank Band of the Okanagan Nation in Canada, in what's now British Columbia. They are a registered First Nations band. And so this video is specifically in appreciation of the fact that without the indigenous inhabitants of North America, the European settlers would not have survived, and that is pretty much a historical fact. Also, in recognition of that fact, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that I am making this video from colonized, conquered, stolen territory. I haven't been able to find out exactly who the original inhabitants of central Pennsylvania are, but from what I can tell, we seem to be on the sort of border area between the territory of the Shawnee, the Susquehannock, and the Lenape, more specifically the Munsee, and possibly the Seneca, although I don't think their territory extended this far south. So the other thing I want to say before I really launch into talking about Grand Chief Derrickson's book is that this is a solicited video. Specifically, the publisher saw that I had reviewed a book on Goodreads, which Grand Chief Derrickson wrote with Chief Arthur Manuel, and so they asked me to read and review on social media Grand Chief Derrickson's new memoir, Fight or Submit, and so this video is #sponsored, sort of, in that they sent me a free book, which is a free digital copy of a book, which is not really sponsorship, but I'm a book influencer. So, anyway, let's talk about Grand Chief Ronald Derrickson's book. So it's a memoir of his life and particularly focusing on his business and political activity, which is frankly pretty amazing. Like, this, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that Derrickson is a living legend in Indigenous circles as well as in the Canadian business community, because unlike a lot of business people, successful business people who build up a mythology around themselves of coming from nothing and being self-made and things like this, Derrickson actually is. So, I want to read you this bit from very early in the memoir, because it actually sort of sums up the overall successful trajectory of his life and career. He says, "I was born and grew up in a shack without plumbing or electricity on the hills overlooking the lake. My earliest memories are of kneeling in the field gathering vegetables alongside my mother, and when I was older, riding our horses along the ridge with my brother Noel. As a young man, I ranched these lands, and for more than a dozen years in the 1970s and 1980s, and again at the turn of the century, I was chief of the Westbank First Nation. Both sides of the road cutting through the reserve are now crowded with stores and businesses on leased reserved lands and deals I negotiated to bring income into what was once the poorest reserve in Canada. During my first 10 years as chief, I increased the band's leasing revenues by more than 3,500%. I fought for every advantage for my people so we could have the economic development we needed to give a future to our children. But I always fought for more than that. I fought and I continue to fight for the land and the resources on our greater Okanagan territory, which encompasses thousands of square kilometers in the BC interior. So this is the sort of, if we were going to say there's a thesis to this memoir, this would sort of be it, this section. This idea of continually fighting, not just for his own advancement, but for the Westbank Band, the Okanagan Nation, and for Indigenous peoples, First Nations peoples throughout Canada, and in a more sort of international sense, fighting for justice, fighting for equity, fighting for fair treatment for people, regardless of their race, their ethnicity, their color, their religion, whatever it is. And this is always, everything in Fight or Submit is always put in the context of settler colonialism in Canada and the tremendous overriding racism that's colored so much of Canadian history. And so, I mean, the first few chapters, after the sort of introductory chapter, like the story that Derrickson tells, his story actually starts generations before he was born, with the entrance of white settlers into Okanagan territory and the gradual process of colonization. But one of the things he emphasizes, and other Indigenous authors have emphasized this as well, people like Arthur Manuel, people like Leanne Simpson, people like Sean Coulthard, people like this have emphasized that the basic fundamental goal of settler colonialism in Canada, as well as in the US, Australia, and maybe to a lesser extent New Zealand, has been to deprive Indigenous peoples of any access to their own lands. So this is really central because it colors not only Derrickson's early experiences growing up in a settler colonial society, but even his later business practices, where so much of the struggle that he goes through to build businesses, both his own personal businesses and also businesses on behalf of his First Nations band, these are characterized by tremendous resistance from white business owners, from the Canadian government, from the government of British Columbia, etc., etc. So this is the key thing. And some of these really stand out, like the legendary assassination attempt on Ron Derrickson in the early 1980s. And that's, like, he tells this story in the book, and it I think sort of encapsulates this struggle. So basically what had happened was that he was elected chief of the Westbank Band in the late 1970s, and basically started, he had already developed by that point several businesses, he'd made a good amount of money, and he took that business sense, this seeming natural ability to spot a deal, to exploit that deal for all that it was worth, and to make sure that it was legally solid, that no one could use the courts or use the law to sort of trick him out of his financial successes. So he brings those skills to the Westbank First Nation, and one of the projects that they did was they leased land to a group of trailer park owners, white trailer park owners who set up trailer parks on reserve lands. And the white trailer park owners were exceedingly reluctant to pay fair market values to a First Nations band. They just fought it tooth and nail at every step, whenever there was a rent increase, which was written into the rental agreements, they would resist with everything they possibly could. And so at one point, this all sort of came to a head, and it's not 100% clear who actually hired this hitman, but someone in that group or a collective within that group hired a hitman who came to Ron Derrickson's house. He was chief of the Westbank First Nation at this point, and he was rapidly increasing the amount of money that the band was bringing in. He was rapidly increasing the quality of life for people by providing better housing, better access to clean water, better access to telephones, things like that. All of these sort of amenities that had been lacking before he became chief. So this hitman comes to his house, knocks on the door. Derrickson opens the door, and this guy takes out what seems to be like a sharpened crowbar or something like this, and starts smashing it into Derrickson's head and arms as he's trying to protect himself. Derrickson manages to get partway up the stairs and kick this guy in the face, and then run upstairs to his gun cabinet and get a pistol out, and he shoots this guy in the shoulder. The guy then flees out the door to go get a shotgun out of his car, and Derrickson shoots him again from the upstairs window, at which point the guy takes off, and he later gets arrested. And Derrickson fights this hitman off, sustaining injuries that required, I think it was 285 stitches. So he was severely injured, and he actually made it out his front door and then collapsed. And probably the only reason he survived is because his son happened to be coming up to the house at the time and found him lying on the front steps in a pool of blood. So, I mean, this is the most physically violent episode in the memoir, but it's symbolic of this racial hatred. Because, I mean, realistically, it's almost impossible to imagine a group of trailer park owners getting so angry at reasonable rent increases from a white landlord that they would hire a hitman to try and kill him. But then the thing that really sort of clinches this as a story about racism in Canada, and about Ron Derrickson overcoming that racism, or challenging that racism, not overcoming in the sense of racism is now gone, because it still very much pervades Canadian culture, but in the sense of Derrickson coming out on top. The immediate next thing that happens is that these trailer park owners hook up with some BC politicians and start making all of these accusations about Derrickson being financially corrupt, about him misusing band funds, about him siphoning off money to his family's businesses, and all these things. And there are all these audits done, there are these investigations done, and they all consistently prove that Derrickson has done nothing wrong. And so he actually ends up, later on, suing most of these people who have attempted to slander him, and he consistently wins those lawsuits as well. So, I mean, this is part of the thing, is he does this tremendous work for his band. Again, like you said in this opening bit, he raises their leasing revenues 3,500% in his first stint as chief in the late 70s and into the 80s. He builds these businesses. He does this tremendous work, and he does it continually in the face of opposition from white business people, from white tenants, from the Canadian government, the government of British Columbia, etc., etc. And he gets involved in these both local British Columbia Indigenous organizations working with other First Nations in British Columbia, but also in the larger sort of pan-Indigenous struggle for rights in Canada. So again, he's this living legend kind of person. He's really quite an amazing guy, and I'm not that interested in memoir as a genre. I don't tend to read autobiographies, but it's a really, really fascinating autobiography.